Jean-Claude Van Damme, $20 million. That's what one man was offered to step into a ring in Las Vegas and finally settle a fight that had been simmering for 30 years. He said yes on the spot. The other guy? He said no. And here's the part that should stop you cold. It wasn't the first time he'd said no. It was the third. Now, if you've spent any time around action movies from the 80s and 90s, you already know the two names we're talking about. But what you might not know is that this isn't really a story about two guys who didn't like each other. It's a story about two totally different ideas of what it means to actually be tough, and what happens when one of those ideas turns out to be the real deal, while the other one turns out to be a very well-produced act. So let's rewind. Let's go all the way back to a scrawny, nervous kid in a Brussels suburb who had absolutely nothing that suggested he'd end up here. Jean-Claude Van Damme. Born Jean-Claude Camille François van Varenberg in 1960, in a little town called Berchem-Saint-Agathe, just outside Brussels. As a kid, he wasn't tough, he wasn't confident, he was the opposite, thin, anxious, the kind of boy a worried father signs up for karate, not because he dreams of raising a champion, but because the kid needs somewhere to put all that nervous energy. That's literally why his dad enrolled him in Shotokan karate at age 10. Not for glory, for survival. And here's the thing nobody tells you about origin stories like this. There's no montage, there's no single dramatic moment where the shy kid suddenly transforms into a warrior. What actually happened was slower and, honestly, way more impressive. He just kept showing up, every day, for years. Van Damme himself has said the real fight was never against an opponent. It was against himself. Against the urge to quit, against being the weak kid forever. That's not a poetic quote for a magazine. That's literally what it took. By his late teens, he wasn't just doing karate anymore. He'd added kickboxing, started competing all over Europe, and in 1979, he won the European Karate Championship as part of Belgium's national team. A year earlier, he'd even picked up the Mr. Belgium bodybuilding title. None of that was manufactured for a movie poster. That was a real competitive resume, built in front of real judges, against real opponents who were actively trying to hand him a loss. Keep that detail in your back pocket, because it's going to matter a lot later. He landed in America in the early 80s with almost no English and an accent so thick that casting agents would cut him off mid-sentence. Nobody in Los Angeles was rolling out a red carpet for him. So what'd he do? He drove a taxi. He drove limos. He delivered pizzas. He put flyers on windshields. He did street corner demonstrations for strangers just to get noticed. He'd walk up to producers in restaurants and introduce himself, and most of them forgot his name within the hour. Then one night he spotted Menahem Golan, the guy running Canon Films, outside a restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. Van Damme threw a kick so high and so clean that Golan actually stopped in his tracks. That one moment eventually opened the door to Bloodsport in 1988. Now, Bloodsport was not some prestige picture. It was shot on the cheap in Hong Kong, based on a story nobody could fully verify, and the studio genuinely considered shelving it. Van Damme fought, literally helped re-edit the thing himself, because he believed in it. And when it finally hit theaters, audiences didn't care about the budget. They cared about him. The kicks were real. The splits were real. You were watching a guy who'd spent 15 years training to do exactly what the camera was capturing. People could feel that it wasn't fake, even if they couldn't have explained why. Steven Seagal. Now let's talk about the other guy. Steven Seagal was born in 1952 in Lansing, Michigan. In his early 20s, he moved to Japan and trained in Aikido, spending years under legitimate teachers, and, according to his own telling, he became the first non-Japanese person to run an Aikido dojo on Japanese soil. So to be clear, the training itself was real. This wasn't a fraud who never set foot in a dojo. But here's where the paths split. Van Damme's road from the training hall to the big screen took 8 grinding years of pizza deliveries and sidewalk demonstrations. Seagal's took one phone call. He happened to be friends with Michael Ovitz, one of the most powerful agents in Hollywood, and one choreographed demo later, he had a contract with Warner Brothers. His debut, Above the Law, came out the same year as Bloodsport, 1988. Now, having connections isn't a crime. What matters is what a guy does once he's got the platform. And almost immediately, Seagal used his to position himself as the only real martial artist in the building. In one of his earliest big interviews, he took shots at Chuck Norris, questioned whether Frank Dux, the guy whose real-life story inspired Bloodsport, was even legit, and when asked about Van Damme's actual competition record, he shrugged it off as, quote, a matter of opinion. Think about that phrase for a second. Not a rebuttal. Not, here's why I disagree. Just a smug little dismissal. Like a documented championship record was somehow up for debate. When Van Damme got asked about it on a late-night show, he just called Seagal a wonderful guy and moved on. Which honestly might have been the sharpest move available. Sometimes not dignifying something is the loudest response you can give. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Because the difference between these two guys wasn't just personality. It showed up right there on screen. Van Damme's kickboxing background gave you fight scenes that were fast, high, and flashy. Every kick was timed for maximum visual payoff. The splits landed exactly when the camera wanted them to. It was athleticism you could see was real. Seagal's Aikido was a completely different animal. And to be fair, Aikido as a discipline is genuinely old and genuinely legitimate. It's built around redirecting an opponent's own momentum, using joint locks and throws that barely require force if you do them right. Against a cooperative training partner in a controlled dojo, it looks incredible. And Seagal's early films captured that beautifully. He moved with this eerie, fluid calm that made him feel more dangerous than Van Damme in a completely different way. But there's a catch, and it's the word cooperative. Fight analysts have pointed this out for decades. Aikido works when your opponent attacks in a predictable, straight-line way. The problem is, no trained fighter attacks like that. UFC commentator Joe Rogan has flat-out said Aikido would never work against a trained fighter. Never. Not in a million years. Combat analyst Jack Slack has made basically the same point. The whole system depends on the kind of textbook attack that any fighter learns to avoid in their very first week of sparring. Seagal's movie opponents worked because the stunt guys were told to attack exactly the way Aikido needs them to. Nobody ever tested what happens when a real opponent does something unpredictable. Nobody, that is, until one very famous incident. Jean LaBelle. This is the story where the whole subtext of this rivalry became impossible to ignore. Jean LaBelle wasn't some random extra. He was a world judo champion, one of the founding fathers of American grappling, and a stuntman with decades of film credits. During production on Out for Justice, Seagal reportedly claimed that no submission hold could put him to sleep. LaBelle, who happened to be working on set, offered to test that theory. What allegedly happened next has been passed around combat sports circles for 30 straight years. LaBelle locked in a rear naked choke. Seagal went out cold. There's an extra detail about a loss of bodily control that may or may not have been exaggerated over the years, but the choke itself? LaBelle has confirmed that part multiple times, on the record. Seagal's version is that it was actually a backstretch that got misunderstood, which, notice, doesn't really deny anything, it just reframes it. That story has stuck around for 3 decades not because people are trying to humiliate the guy, but because it lines up perfectly with everything else people had already suspected. The rivalry at its peak. Let's give credit where it's due. In the early 90s, this rivalry was completely real, not manufactured. Under Siege in 1992 pulled in over $150 million worldwide, a genuinely smart action thriller that used Seagal's stillness as an actual character trait instead of a limitation. Hard to kill, marked for death, out for justice. These weren't embarrassing flops. They proved there was real appetite for this quiet, efficient, almost eerily calm kind of action hero. Meanwhile, Van Damme was stacking up Universal Soldier, Time Cop, and Hard Target. That last one directed by John Woo, with such over-the-top, operatic gun choreography that it briefly made Van Damme feel like the most purely cinematic action star in Hollywood. Box office numbers were neck and neck. Magazine covers were split down the middle. Nobody could say for sure who'd come out on top. It genuinely felt like a real competition, not just two egos fighting for headlines. When it stopped being about movies, and this is where it stops being about box office numbers and starts being about what happened when the cameras turned off. Sylvester Stallone was actually present at a party in the late 90s when Van Damme, fed up with years of Seagal's public digs, walked right up and confronted him. Face to face, in front of a room full of people. No press release, no publicist smoothing it over afterward. A direct challenge, and Seagal left the party. That same night, the tension almost boiled over again. Van Damme followed him to a nightclub in Miami and waited outside for 2 straight hours. Seagal never came out. Years later, Van Damme described it with almost no emotion at all. If he sees me, he runs. He wasn't performing outrage for the cameras. He was just stating a pattern he'd watched repeat itself, offer after offer, for years. The same man who once implied Van Damme's championship record was a matter of opinion had now, on multiple separate occasions, avoided every single chance to back up an opinion with anything physical. Sean Connery. There's one more incident worth mentioning, even though it happened earlier and involves someone else entirely. Because it fits the pattern perfectly. Back in the early 80s, before either action star had made it big, Seagal was hired as a fight choreographer on the James Bond film Never Say Never Again, brought in specifically to teach Sean Connery some Aikido moves. Connery wasn't a novice either. He had an honorary black belt and had trained for previous Bond films. During a rehearsal, Seagal was demonstrating a technique and ended up breaking Connery's wrist. Years later, on a late-night show in 1996, Connery brought it up with the kind of restraint that tells you he'd carefully decided exactly how much he wanted to say. "I got a little cocky," Connery said, "because I thought I knew what I was doing." Notice, he didn't accuse Seagal of anything. He didn't need to. A story about a martial arts instructor breaking the wrist of the person he was supposed to be protecting speaks for itself. On-set behavior. And the pattern kept showing up on set too. John Leguizamo, while filming Executive Decision, laughed at something Seagal said during rehearsal. Seagal's response was to slam him against a brick wall. Leguizamo later joked that Seagal had used a completely unrelated martial art on him, a technique from a discipline Seagal didn't even practice, against someone who hadn't attacked him at all. Then there's Steven Tobolowsky, who worked with Seagal on The Glimmer Man. Between takes, Seagal reportedly kept trying to convince Tobolowsky that his character, a serial killer, should somehow survive the movie, because Seagal had decided his own on-screen persona shouldn't kill quite so many people anymore. They filmed the scene as written anyway. Seagal then improvised extra dialogue, suggesting his character was relieved he hadn't killed Tobolowsky's. So much so that the director had to bring Tobolowsky back in later to re-record dialogue, clarifying that, no, his character had definitely died. It's almost comedic when you step back from it. A man so wrapped up in his own image that he couldn't separate his character's morality from his own. Falling and getting back up. Meanwhile, Van Damme's own life in the mid-90s was falling apart in full public view. No spin, no image management, just the truth. His struggles with cocaine were widely reported. His marriages collapsed in rapid succession. His box office numbers dipped hard. And through all of it, he never tried to rewrite the narrative. He said plainly that he'd fallen. He went through treatment. He talked about it openly in interview after interview, with a level of honesty that felt almost jarring for a guy who'd spent 15 years building an invincible action hero image. That honesty reached its peak in 2008 with a film called JCVD, where Van Damme played a fictionalized version of himself, broke, behind on child support payments, trapped in the middle of a bank robbery in Belgium, stripped of every single prop that usually props up an action star's image. Critics who had spent 2 decades writing him off as a B-movie punchline suddenly found themselves reviewing a genuinely powerful performance. It wasn't a different actor. It was the same guy, finally given a role that let people see what had always been underneath. Seagal never made his version of that film. He never gave that kind of interview. The image stayed sealed shut. The mystical martial arts master. The guy with supposed intelligence connections. Someone who felt untouchable because he was never actually tested. But sealed systems don't last forever. Eventually they just shrink. His films moved to direct-to-video by the late 90s, and never made it back to theaters. Allegations piled up over the years. Misconduct claims, reports of on-set aggression, questions about fabricated parts of his backstory. In 2016, he took Russian citizenship and became something of an unofficial cultural spokesperson connected to Vladimir Putin, which recontextualized basically everything that came before it for a lot of former fans. The verdict. So here's where we land. When people run online polls today, asking who would have actually won that fight, or whose career meant more, or who really represented what action movies were supposed to be about, Van Damme wins by something like 90%. And keep in mind, most of the people voting aren't martial arts experts. They can't break down the technical difference between Shotokan and Aikido. What they're actually responding to is something much simpler. The difference between a guy who showed up, again and again, and a guy who made absolutely sure he never had to. It's the difference between a career that was tested in real competition, long before it ever touched a film set, and a career built on a single impressive demo for the right producer at the right moment. Now, at 65, Van Damme talks about the toll of all this, with the same bluntness he's always had. The joints that carried 40 years of competing and filming. The mornings that don't feel the way they used to. He talks about the addiction, about rebuilding his life, about the failed marriages. And he doesn't dress any of it up. He just states it. The same flat, matter-of-fact way he described that Vegas fight offer, getting turned down for the third time. Like it's just information anybody's free to look up. And honestly, this was never really a story about Steven Seagal. Seagal is just the contrast that makes everything about Van Damme easier to see clearly. The mirror that shows you exactly what he isn't, by showing you what the alternative looked like over 30 long years. What Van Damme's actually been telling the truth about, since he was a frail 10-year-old kid getting bullied into a Brussels dojo, is one simple idea. None of this means anything unless it can actually be tested. The image isn't the substance. And getting offered a real fight 3 times and saying no 3 times, that's not a matter of opinion. 2 completely different philosophies went head-to-head across an entire decade. One of them was flashy, real, and occasionally stumbled in public. The other stayed polished, protected, and always found a reason to be somewhere else. Audiences have been quietly voting on which one actually mattered ever since. And Van Damme just said out loud, in his 60s, what the scoreboard had already been telling us the whole time. So, what do you think? Would you have taken that $20 million fight? Drop your takedown in the comments. And if you're into stories like this, the real ones behind the action movie legends, make sure you're subscribed, because there are a lot more of these coming.